Chapter 8 Danny Saves a Friend. Lunchtime, a guard shouted. The sun shone high overhead. Danny looked to Jim Davis, who leaned on his hoe only 20 feet away. "We done good this morning," Davis said. "You're a good worker." The prisoners laid down their tools and made their way to the shade of the trees. They sat in groups on logs and on the ground. A cook served bowls of beans from the back of a wagon. Davis sat beside Danny, protecting him from Mr. Dime. "You can't watch him forever," Dime said. "I'm going to kill that boy. You wait and see." "Your killing days are over, Dime," said a guard. "I'm tired of burying anybody you pick a fight with. No more, you hear me?" When the day's work was finished, they returned to the prison barracks. As they neared the building, a guard yanked Danny's arm and dragged him through the door. He shoved him on his bed face down and chained his hands and feet to the bed. "Any more trouble out of you and I'll kill you myself," he said, and turned to go. After a week of hard work, Danny earned the respect of the guards and some of the prisoners. He was no longer chained to his bed, but many times a day he felt the mean glare of Mr. Dime waiting for his time to get even. One morning, as the prisoners finished their coffee by the campfire, Davis stood up. "Time we get to work," he said. The prisoners tossed back their final swallow of coffee. But Davis didn't take another step. Instead, he grabbed his chest with both hands. As Danny watched, Davis slumped over and began breathing hard. His face turned white and his eyes rolled back in his head. The men laughed. "Somebody shoot you, Jim?" a prisoner asked. Davis didn't reply. Prisoners laughed harder, thinking Davis was joking. Davis rocked back and forth. His arms fell to his sides. "Somebody call a doctor," joked the prisoner. The men howled with laughter. But Danny knew that Jim Davis was not making a joke. He was dying in front of them, and the men were laughing. Danny had watched his grandfather save Mr. Begay's life 7 years ago. Mr. Begay had grabbed his chest and fallen to the ground. His grandfather beat him on the chest with both fists. When Mr. Begay's face turned white, he blew air into his mouth. Danny closed his eyes and remembered every detail. He was only 9 years old, but he never forgot the day his grandfather saved Mr. Begay's life. When Davis fell backwards and landed on the fire, the men grew silent. "He's hurt," the prisoner said. Danny knew what to do. He leaped to his friend. He rolled him out of the fire and on his back. While the soldiers and prisoners watched, Danny took a deep breath. He opened Davis's mouth and blew air into it. Then he doubled up his fist and pounded hard on his chest. For several long minutes, as the others stood frozen, Danny Blackgoat pounded his friend's chest and blew air into his lungs. Finally, Davis opened his eyes. What did," Davis stammered, unable to speak. More than ever, Danny wished he had the words to say. He patted Davis on the chest and looked into his eyes. Davis closed his eyes again, but Danny felt his chest move up and down. "He's breathing," he thought. "He will live." "Let's get him to the doctor," a soldier said. As 3 strong prisoners carried him away, Davis moved his lips, searching for the words. He lifted his head, looking for Danny. When he spotted him, he took a deep breath. "You saved my life, Fire Eye," Jim Davis said. Danny nodded and lifted his palm to his friend. "Back to work," a guard shouted. Danny took his hoe and hurried to the far side of the cotton row. The prisoners moved quietly back to the fields. No one spoke. Everyone walked with their eyes to the ground. Jim Davis was the only man that every prisoner respected and every prisoner liked. He was their friend. Danny worked with a madness. He raised his hoe high and flung his whole body into the swing, burying the blade deep into the cracked brown dirt. Why did this happen to Jim Davis, he asked himself. Over and over he swung his hoe until it slipped from his grip and sailed over his head. Danny watched the hoe and his eyes grew big. The hoe was flying toward a group of prisoners, and Mr. Dime was one of them. He was on his knees planting cottonseed. The wooden hoe handle struck Mr. Dime in the back of the neck. He fell forward, but not for long. He jumped to his feet and picked up Danny's hoe. "It's that Indian boy's hoe," shouted a prisoner. Mr. Dime slowly turned to face the boy. Danny stood and waited. When Mr. Dime started walking in his direction, Danny wanted to run. He knew what Mr. Dime would do to him, with no Jim Davis to stand in his way. But today was not a day for running. Jim Davis had almost died. This was a day for facing his enemy. Mr. Dime expected him to run. "Circle him so he can't get away," he shouted. Now Danny Blackgoat ran, but not as Mr. Dime expected. He ran as fast as he could, straight at the bullying man. When Danny grew close, Mr. Dime crouched into a fighting stance and lifted his fists. Danny didn't slow down. He didn't circle his enemy like a boxer would do. No, he ran faster still. When he was 5 feet from Mr. Dime, he planted his left foot hard and jumped. He hit Mr. Dime in the right kneecap with both feet. "Ow!" Mr. Dime cried out. He rolled on his belly and grabbed his knee with both hands. Danny leaped on his back and grabbed his hair, just like Mr. Dime had done to him that first day in the fields. He slammed his head in the dirt 3, 4, 5 times. But Mr. Dime was strong. He was also proud. He ignored the pain in his knee and reached behind himself. He took Danny's wrist and flung the boy over his head and to the ground. Then he rose and walked toward Danny. He leaned over and picked up Danny's hoe. Without stopping, he whipped the hoe handle and landed a hard blow to Danny's back. Danny felt a flash of pain through his whole body. Mr. Dime smiled and flipped the hoe from one hand to the next. He now held it so the next blow would sink the blade into the trouble-making Indian boy. "One blow and you're dead, Fire Eye," he said with a sneer on his face. "Are you ready for that?" Danny said nothing. He met Mr. Dime's strong gaze with one of his own. "Maybe Jim Davis and I will die on the same day," Danny thought. "Maybe it is meant to be." "Let's put it to a vote," Mr. Dime said. "So, who wants to bury this boy today, right here in the cotton field?" He turned and expected his fellow prisoners to cheer him on. Instead, no one said a word. For the first time in Mr. Dime's life, the other prisoners were standing up to him. They looked at Danny Blackgoat and saw a brave young man who had done something they had never had the courage to do themselves. This Indian boy had thrown himself at the meanest bully they had ever known, a man known for killing a dozen men. Mr. Dime asked again, "Who wants to help me kill this animal?" One by one the men turned away. They picked up their hoes and walked back to work. If Mr. Dime wanted to kill the Indian, he would have to do it on his own. Mr. Dime cursed the other prisoners. "You are no better than he is, you bunch of cowards," he called to them as they moved away. When he turned to Danny, the boy stood his ground. Mr. Dime struck him in the face with the handle. Danny tried to block the blow with his wrist, but Mr. Dime was powerful. In a few minutes, he stood over Danny, kicking him again and again. "That's enough," shouted the guard. "Pow!" He fired his shotgun into the air to make his point. Mr. Dime picked up his basket of cotton seeds and walked away, leaving Danny Blackgoat lying in a pool of dark blood. 2 prisoners carried him to his cot in the barracks. Danny moaned in agony. Whichever way he rolled, a new pain shot through him. "Lie still for a moment," a man's voice commanded. Danny looked up to see a soldier he had never seen before. "I'm a doctor," the man said. "I'm here to help you." "He's an Indian," said a prisoner. "He don't know how to talk." The doctor nodded and turned to Danny. He moved a finger to his lips, telling Danny to be quiet. Then he held his palms in front of him and moved them up and down slowly, telling Danny to stay still. Danny relaxed. The doctor picked up Danny's arms one at a time. He lifted his legs, too. After 10 minutes, he stood and said, "Well, he doesn't have any broken bones. He's lucky. He wouldn't be the first man Mr. Dime killed."